talk about. Okay. And, David has written, I think, 36 books, many articles. He's appeared on the Discovery Network and Science Networks, and a lot of done a lot of speaking on amateur astronomy and what it's done. But he's, the proof's in the pudding, and the proof is the discoveries David has made individually and together with other amateurs that have had significance in astronomy, in the scientific realm, which I'm sure he will. I assume that's what he'll talk about. I don't know exactly what he'll talk about, but I would assume that's what he'll talk about. With that, David, I'll leave it up to you.
Well, thank you, Terry. And it's really so nice to sit back and listen to a few things about myself, just to make sure I've done something in my life. And I really want to thank you for that introduction, and especially thank Donna for inviting me to give the presentation tonight. This is the second time I've done a lecture for a group that Donna has been in charge of, and it's really my pleasure. And I hope to get back at some point in person to meet you and to give a lecture in person. My topic tonight is A Nightwatchman's Journey, The Road Not Taken. It is the same title as the title on my autobiography. And so it is a chance for me to give a little bit of an overview of what I've done in my life, just to show you that I haven't just been getting up late and going to bed late and watching television, watching a lot of Star Trek and wasting time. Somewhere in all that, I've managed to find 23 comets. I've managed to have a number of observing sessions. I think I can even show you the number of observing sessions that I've had in this book. The one that I had this morning was session number 22,282. And that was a session where I went outside and I looked at the sun with a telescope in my observatory out in the back. And there were 2 little sunspots on the sun and 8 prominences on the sun. And so the sun, our little sun is getting active. And so I think that's exciting that you'll be able to go out pretty soon with your small telescope, properly filtered, and look at the sun. It's a beautiful thing to do. The other thing I love to do is go out and watch shooting stars. And I could say that's a more recent thing, but that would be a lie. I have actually observed shooting stars since July the 4th, 1956. I was in a summer camp, Twin Lake Camp. I hated the place. It was in Vermont. A lot of you may know Vermont and the Green Mountain State, and a little town called Brandon, Vermont. And just a few miles south of Brandon was Twin Lake Camp, which is where I went to. I hated the place. I hated it. I didn't want to go home. I wrote every day to my mom and my dad, begging them to take me out of that place. And I promised that I'd be such a good boy if I returned. I would make the bed, sweep the floor. I'd be so good, such a good son, they wouldn't even know I was there. Mom wrote back and said, well, I really appreciate that you want to be a good son, but you really have to learn to be a good son from a distance. You're going to stay at that camp. And I was really pretty depressed about it. And then 4 days after the camp began in 1956, we went out with the camp to watch fireworks. And it was July the 4th. Being from Canada, I didn't know from July the 4th. I didn't know about, but I enjoyed watching fireworks. And then the director sent us home, back to the cabin, before it got too dark. And we're walking up the hill to the cabin, and I sort of looked up at the sky, the darkening sky, as I was walking back to the cabin. And I saw a shooting star. It wasn't a very bright shooting star. It started kind of from near overhead and kind of shot down towards the bright star Vega and then disappeared. It wasn't bright. It wasn't really all that spectacular, but I saw it. I looked at the others and I said, did any of you just see that shooting star just now? And they all looked at me and they said, no, we didn't. And then I thought, is this shooting star just for me? Was it somehow meant just for me? And so I took the information about that shooting star and put it into my 8-year-old David brain. And I let it just fester there for a while, where it did for 4 years. And the next thing that happened, in the spring of 1960, our teacher wanted us all to give public speeches, public lectures to the class. And I was one that he asked me to give a lecture. The topic was comets. And I talked about how comets are really, really big things with tails and lovely things that screech across the sky and just beautiful to see. And then I said the most famous comet of all is Halley's Comet, as Terry mentioned earlier. And but it's not going to come around for many, many years, not till 1986, and we won't be able to see it. By 1986, I was already well into astronomy, and I did get to see Halley's Comet and study it a little bit in 1986. That summer, on June the 21st, 1960, I was riding my bicycle to our 6th grade class picnic. And I rode along Upper Belmont, turned right on Sunnyside Avenue, went down to Victoria, left on Victoria, and then left on a large boulevard. I was making a nice, beautiful left turn, not realizing that the sidewalk was rapidly approaching. The bicycle stopped very suddenly when it hit the curb of the sidewalk. It stopped. I, on the other hand, did not. I went sailing ever so graciously over my bicycle, hitting my arm on the curb and breaking it. There was another boy nearby, and he came and he said, do you need some help? And I said, yeah, if you could just lift up my bike and help me to walk to the school, and I'll see the nurse and I'll be fine. She'll put a Band-Aid on it. And as I stood up, there was such pain in my arm and I'd never experienced before. And I looked at the other boy and I said, I'm not going to be able to walk. What I'd like you to do is to go to the next block where see that policeman there? I'd like you to go and get him. And which he did, and the cop must have flown down the block. They took me to the Montreal Children's Hospital, and I was fitted with a nice large cast. And very soon after, I was given a book as a get well present from a cousin. The book was called Our Sun and the Worlds Around It. I read that book. I read it again, read it a third time and a fourth time, and I'm still reading it. That really hooked me under the night sky. And I decided that I was going to become an astronomer. That's what I wanted to do. That's what was interesting in life. And Dad and Mom at the table were talking about a number of things. Of course, I would always interrupt and talk about astronomy. And then one night, Dad said, David, I would like you very much. I would like you to talk sometimes about astronomy, but you did all last week. This week, I'd like you to talk about something else. Next week, we'll talk about astronomy again. And I looked at him and I thought to myself, okay, Dad, I won't talk about astronomy. And then he said, don't let astronomy be the most important thing in your life. And I think that's good advice. And I kind of agreed and nodded my head. And I said, you're right. I will not let astronomy be the most important thing in my life. It will be the only thing in my life. Years later, a couple of years later, when I was away from home as an asthmatic, I spent that time about a year at the Jewish National Home for Asthmatic Children in Denver. And I went back to see a total eclipse of the sun that summer in July of 1962. It was my first total eclipse. And I remember when we were getting ready the day before, Dad was taking a nap, and he woke up and he was in a horrible mood. And he was snarling and he said, all David cares about, all he cares about are his damn stars. And that's all he talks about. I noticed my brother Richard sort of smiling there in the background. And Dad would eventually regret what he said that day. I kind of let it go. But I think about 10 years later, I remember him saying, David, do you remember when I said that all you care about are your damn stars? And he said, yes. And I said, yes. And he said, boy, was I wrong about that. And I said, well, actually, you weren't. I was a real loudmouth at the time. I was just a loudmouth kid. And I should have accepted what you said for what you did. And so we ended up discussing that years later. But it was nice of him to admit that he was wrong about that I really picked it up. And what he told me at the time was that I had no idea that you would get as passionate about the night sky as any one of us are about anything. That was what you've done, and that's what you're doing. And I'm really very pleased that you did that. Anyway, there was one night that he was at dinner, and he said, you know, I told you not to talk about astronomy. So I'm going to talk about astronomy. And I thought, this is pretty good. And he said, when I was about your age, I read a book called Coal of Spyglass Mountain. It was a story about a young boy who was mistreated by his father, as I have yelled at you a few times, and so badly that they finally sent him off to boarding school. At the boarding school, he met a teacher who was an astronomer and who observed something called variable stars, stars that change in brightness from one night to the other and 1 month to the other. And he just got fascinated with it. After he left the school, he was able to save his pennies, and he got himself a telescope and he built himself an observatory on what he called Spyglass Mountain. And as he grew older, one night, he discovered evidence of life on Mars from that observatory. The minute he made that discovery, but the second he made that discovery, someone came breaking into the observatory with a rifle and took pot shots at him, trying to kill him. And anyway, one of the shots actually hit Joshua Cole, but it didn't kill him. Instead, he was taken out and put in bed and slowly recovered. And he thought, well, I reported the fact that I made this discovery of life on Mars, but no one's going to pay any attention to it now. And then someone came into his room with a whole pile of newspapers and said, look, it's what's happening. Something's broke. And Dad says, I don't remember reading a lot of that book, but I do remember the ending of it. And I'm going to quote to you the ending. And he said, first to report discovery, coal of Spyglass Mountain, famous in a night. My father never forgot that book. And as Dad grew older and he began to think about his life and about the things that he had done, the things that he hadn't done, his family, my mom, his children, my brothers and sister, he began to forget things. And at first the forgetting was not something we noticed very well, but then it became pretty obvious as time went on. Started to forget places, started to forget names, and on one dreadful, terrible day, he forgot that I was his son. But he never forgot Coal of Spyglass Mountain. One day, we were at his winter home in Florida. I was taking a walk with him, and he was talking a word salad, making no sense at all. And I thought, this is a waste of time. I hardly know who he is. He doesn't know who I am. Alzheimer's disease is like attending the funeral of a person who is still living and is still dying day by day. Anyway, I was listening to him talk, and suddenly, like when you have a light bulb is about to burn out, suddenly it'll flicker brightly as if there was nothing wrong with it. And suddenly that happened with my father. And he turned to me and looked at me and he said, "David, did you ever find Coal Spyglass Mountain?" I really would have liked to have read it. And I had to admit at the time that I had not. And Dad laughed and he said, "Well, it doesn't matter. I'm so stupid now, I couldn't read it anyway." And I looked at Dad and I said, "Dad, you are ill. You have Alzheimer's disease. But as long as you're my father, there is no way in heaven that you are stupid. And don't ever think that you are." And that was a nice moment. And of course, Dad forgot about it afterwards. But whenever I read that book, and I have since found a copy of it, and I've read it, and my wife Wendy has enjoyed it, I always think not just of Joshua Cole, but of my dad and how much joy it brought to him. And I remember one of the things that I wanted to do when I was growing up was not, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, not to go to a summer camp. But Mom and Dad really believed in the camping experience. And he said that, why don't we try something different? Why don't we send him to a science camp instead of to a regular sports camp? And I thought that would be a pretty fair compromise. And I went to a place called Twin Valleys Camp. The experience was something that I had for 3 years, and I just loved it. In the second year, our director said, "We're all going to do a science fair project." And I thought, oh, that's going to be easy. We come up with the idea Thursday, we build a project Friday, we display it Saturday for the parents, and then we're done with it. And Ernie said, no, that's not the kind of project I want. I want this to be a project that you won't forget. I want this to be a project that you'll spend the entire summer planning, that you'll spend the entire summer wondering about and hoping that you're going to get right. A project so difficult that it might even last the rest of your life. A project so challenging that it might fail. Fail? That's not what we learn in school. And we sort of all giggled a little bit. And Ernie said, you think I'm joking, don't you?" I said, "We sure as heck hope you're joking." And then he said, "Watch your language." And then he said, "I've never been more serious in my life. If everything you did succeeded right out of the box, what have you learned? You haven't learned anything. Failure is the great teacher. If you try something and fail, and you pick it up and you try again, and you never give up, that's what the teacher is. That's when you learn something. That's when something sticks with you." I came up with an idea for a project that summer, but it wasn't very satisfying. And it wasn't until the end of the summer, that fall, that I heard about two Japanese amateur astronomers, Ikeya and Seki, who had discovered this wonderful comet. It was the great comet, turned out to be the great comet of 1965, Comet Ikeya Seki. And as we're all getting excited with this comet on its way to surround the sun and become very, very bright, I was walking to school one morning and I'm thinking, I can do that. In fact, I want to do that. I thought about it for a tenth of a second. I said, this is going to be the project. I am going to start a search for comets. And I knew that that would be a project that could easily last the rest of my life. And I finished my walk to school. I was all excited about it, looking up stuff about it, about comets, about how one would go about searching for them, and planning out a search for comets. It was also the time for a matriculation exam in French orals. And I notice my brother is smiling at this point. And Mr. Hutchison, you remember him, he was giving the presentation. At least he was giving the testing. And it was my turn, sitting in the boardroom. He asked the questions. Finally, he said, "What do you wish to do as a career?" And I was all excited. And I sat up straight in my chair. I looked at him and I said, "Monsieur Hutchison, je veux découvrir une comète." Mr. Hutchison, I would like to discover a comet. Mr. Hutchison looked around, he took off his glasses, he looked at the others at the table, he looked at me and put back his glasses on. And he looked at me and said, "Mr. Levy, how the hell do you expect to make any money doing something like that?" And we all laughed. We all had a good laugh over it, and so did he. And he said, "Okay, I'm going to give you credit for that answer. If only because it's the most unusual answer to this question I've ever received. I'm going to give you credit. However, you had better discover a comet for me within 20 years, because if you don't, I'm going to come back and I'm going to lower your grade." And that was the challenge. I started searching for comets on the 17th of December, 1965. I discovered my first comet on the 13th of November, 1984, 19 years later, beating Mr. Hutchison's goal by 1 year. So I did it, but it was pretty close. Then I got the hang of it. I found another one in 1987, found a third in 1987, fourth in 1988, a fifth in 1990, and sixth in 91. And then I had the good fortune to start observing photographically with Eugene and Carolyn Shoemaker. I may be pretty good at searching for comets. I found quite a few of them. I am not, repeat, not very good at photographs. And I'm about to prove that to you. I'm now going to share the screen. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to see this. Do you see the picture that I'm showing you now? Do you see it? Do you see the picture?
Yes.
Somebody wave if you've seen it. Okay. All right, you've seen it.
Looks good.
That is probably the worst photograph of any stars that I've ever taken. It is in focus and the stars are tracking properly, but there's nothing there. There are these three stars and a fuzzy spot on the picture on the left. On the picture on the right, there are three stars and a fuzzy spot. The only thing that's different is that the fuzzy spot is not in the same position as it is in the first picture. The fuzzy spot has moved. That fuzzy spot is a comet. And I am now going to try to stop sharing, if I can figure out how to do that. There, okay. And now, okay, now back so that you get me, and let's see if you can actually see me again. And this is not a background, by the way. This is a real telescope. This is Minerva, one of my favorite telescopes. I've never discovered a comet with this telescope, but I think I've used it for more hours of comet hunting than any other. And this is a telescope. It's very small. It's a 6-inch f4. I can bring it inside, put it right next to the camera, so all of you can see it. And if I say anything wrong, the telescope will shatter its mirror at me, so I'll make it correct. Now, that picture that you just saw, I took on the 23rd of March of 1993. There was a weird story to that picture, and it was not my favorite picture. In fact, I remember thinking as I was taking this, I sure hope I never have to show this picture to anybody. Anyway, 2 days later, Carolyn is looking at these pictures, and she put in those two pictures that I had taken that night, and she moves down and across and comes across the fuzzy spot. and moves right past it. For a couple of seconds, then she says, "What was that?" She moves back over it. And she looked at it, and she looked at me, and she said, "David, I don't know what I've got, but it looks like a squashed comet." Now, Gene Shoemaker at the time was in the darkroom moving pictures. But he heard what Carolyn said, and he said, "Just a minute, don't do anything. Let me get a look at this." And he came out, and he looked through the stereo microscope, and Carolyn had gotten up, and she was standing near me. And I looked at her, and I said, "You're joking, aren't you?" And she said, "No, I'm not joking. This is for real." And then I needed to look at what a squash comet looked like. And now you've all seen that. It was really very, very special. There was not one comet with one tail. There were like 5 or 6 of them in a row, each one with a tail, and then a bar of cometary light off to each side. And I'm thinking, this is really not right for even a comet. But we did report it. And I remember calling a friend of mine who was working at Kitt Peak National Observatory that very night. His name was Jim Scotty. And I called him and told him that we had picked up something, and it had clouded over. And I'm wondering if he could take a look at it. And he said, "Well, I'm pretty busy, David, but I'll try to find some time." I gave him a position and we let it go. But 2 hours later, called him back. He picked up the phone. He says, "Oh," and I said, "Is that you, Jim?" He said, "Hmm." And I said, "Do we have a comet, Jim?" He said, "Boy, do you guys ever have a comet. It is the most unusual cometary form I've ever seen in my life." And the very next day, he reported his observations, and they were actually as part of the Discovery observation, were the observations that Jim had made. Jim Scotty and I have been very, very good friends over many years. I'm very sad to report that his son, Christopher, his young son, Christopher, has just passed away from a failed liver very suddenly. And this is a very sad thing. And but it does not affect the fact that Jim is and has been for many years one of my closest friends. Well, that was just the first part of that particular comet, first part of the story of it. We sort of kept watching it, and I remember after we finished observing that particular week at Palomar Observatory, I drove back to my home southeast of Tucson, set up my telescope, looked through it at Jupiter, moved the telescope about half a degree to the north of Jupiter, and with difficulty, I was able to see this new comet of ours. And it was really very, very special. And it stayed special. I remember the discovery of the comet was so unusual, it made it to page 19 of section 4 of the New York Times. And I thought that's pretty good for a comet discovery to make it to the New York Times at all. 2 months later, we're observing again at Palomar Observatory. Carolyn is scanning films from the night before. Gene is inside cutting film for the night to come. And I am reading my email. There's email from the Central Bureau for Astronomical Telegrams. The director, Brian Marsden, is saying that this comet, Shoemaker-Levy, is no longer considered to be a comet that is orbiting the sun as most comets do. This comet is clearly orbiting the planet Jupiter. It's also clear that this comet got very close to Jupiter on the 8th of July of 1992. It approached within 20,000 kilometers of Jupiter's cloud tops. We have just calculated that on July the 16th, 1994, this comet will again approach Jupiter, and it will approach within 3 Jovian radii, within a third of a Jovian diameter, that's what I meant, from the center of Jupiter. And then he let it go for that page. And then there was a second announcement in which he said, for those of you who couldn't figure it out, what I'm trying to say is that on July 16th, this comet is going to collide with Jupiter. And his calculations were that there was approximate 60% chance that the comet was going to collide. About 3 days later, another group of astronomers in California upped the ante and said the chances are now 90%, 95% plus that all of the fragments are going to collide. And that's exactly what happened. From July the 16th to July 23rd, all of Comet SL9 collided with Jupiter. It was a week to end all weeks. It was the highlight of my professional life. And I say that word on purpose because it was not the highlight of my whole life. The highlight, I've made two good decisions in my life. One of them was to start searching for comets that led to the discoveries of the comets that I found, plus the co-discovery of Shoemaker-Levy 9. The smartest decision I ever made was clearly, without a doubt, to meet and marry Wendy. And that is the best decision I've made. Next year, we're going to be married 25 years. And every day I just love her more and more. And I hope you heard that, sweetie. Okay, thanks. Anyway, that was quite the week for me. I'd already met Wendy at the time, although we weren't really that close. That week I got to meet the president. Bill Clinton was his name at the time. And I got to chat at length with Vice President Gore, who was not at all interested in politics that day. He just wanted to talk about comets, wanted to talk about the fact that he's opening his house so that people can come and look at the comet. And I thought, why would people want to come to your house and look at the comet? The answer was that the US Naval Observatory is his house. So a couple of nights later, get into this long line at the big refractor of the Naval Observatory. And I'm standing in line and people were urging me to go forward to be at the front of the line, but I didn't really want to do that. And finally, I got to look and see this wonderful impact spot on Jupiter, a big black dark splotch. That was really something. The spots on Jupiter lasted for, I would say, almost a year. They were the darkest and most obvious features ever seen on Jupiter, including the Great Red Spot, which has been visible since about the 1660s. And this was really something to be able to see and enjoy. And after that was over, the week in Washington came to an end. I flew home, went into my own house, sat down on a chair, and I don't think I just sat on that chair for like 2 days without moving. I was so exhausted, but feeling so good about it. That's half of my life story. The fact that I got interested in comets, found comets, and continue to search for comets. A couple of nights ago, the last clear night we had, I actually did 2 hours of visual comet searching. I also occasionally do photographic searching, but I'm not very good at that, so I concentrate on the visual. Anyway, the other part of my astronomical life has to do with poetry. When I was growing up, my dad tried to get me interested in Shakespeare. In fact, he told me that I really want to see you as my son take up an interest in Shakespeare. It started one day when I was a kid. I was having a big argument with my older brother, Richard, who I'm sure will remember that. And obviously he was winning the argument. And as we're going on, I thought, well, I'm not going to win this argument with words, so I'm going to have to throw something at him. So I picked up the closest thing I could find, which was a copy of Hamlet, a book, and I threw it at him. It missed. Richard was pretty good at dodging bullets at the time, and I thought, okay, we'll end this. At that very moment, my father walked in, and I thought, oh my goodness, it's going to be hell to pay now. He quietly came into my brother's room, picked up the book, and he presented it to me. He said, I don't mind that you had an argument with your brother. I don't even mind if you hit your brother. But don't you ever, ever throw a book at him or anyone else again. And that was such an odd thing for him to say. I said, why not? And I'll never forget what he said. He said, because books are friends. When you're reading a book, it's as if the author is inviting you into her or his house to say, this is what my life was like when I was a kid. And it's a situation that I live with to this day. One of the books that I wrote, in fact, the very first book that I wrote was in the 5th grade. I took my mom's typewriter, put paper into it, and I wrote a book about our beagle. And Richard, I don't think you might know this story. I'm going to tell you right now. I wrote a book about our dog. It was before astronomy. So even though I've looked at it a lot lately, there's nothing in it about the sun or the stars and the moon or anything. After Wendy and I got married, she said, you know, you're a pretty good writer and some of your books are okay and others not so much. But my favorite book of all the books you've written was Clipper, the one you wrote when you were a kid. And she said that a number of times to the point that I decided it's time later in life, I'm no longer 8, that I should write another edition of Clipper. And I have just completed doing that. And I'm looking for a publisher. So far, no luck, but you never know what will happen. It's a book for children, and it's about a magic dog and a magic telescope that takes this group of children through the solar system, to the moon, to the planets, out to the nearest suns, out to the distant clusters in our galaxy, to the distant galaxies, to the filaments of clusters of galaxies, the superclusters, and even the voids, all in 65 pages of writing. And and at this point, I can make the admission that I come to you under false pretenses, and therefore you don't have to pay me for my lecture tonight. I do not know anything about astronomy officially. I've never taken a course in astronomy. I don't know the first thing about it. But I don't think there's anyone in the world more passionate about the night sky than I am. I just love it. I love being out there. And I've never been out under the stars and then not come in feeling a lot better than I did than before I went out. Anyway, back to Shakespeare. Dad told me that he really wanted me to inherit his love of Shakespeare. I really thought he told me that so many times that I thought he was going to disinherit me, take me out of his will, if I did not inherit his love of Shakespeare. And I did. I took Shakespeare in high school, took it in college. And I remember reading King Lear in my 3rd year at Acadia. Reading the book, reading the play, and getting to the line, these late eclipses of the sun and moon. Shakespeare is spending 2 pages talking about eclipses. And I marked it as something of interest, but I never made the connection that Shakespeare was interested in the night sky. And it wasn't until about 15 years ago that I decided that I was going to try to complete my education and do a doctorate on the night sky in the time of William Shakespeare. I did that at the Hebrew University. It is something that followed on my master's degree that I did in Canada at Queen's. While I was there, the person that I wrote about was Gerard Manley Hopkins. And he wrote a poem that I have to tell you is my favorite. and I'm going to quote it to you. I am like a slip of comet, scarce worth discovery, in some corner seen bridging the slender difference of two stars. But when she sights the sun, she grows and sizes and spins her skirts out, while her central star shakes the cocooning mists. And so she comes to fields of light. Millions of traveling rays pierce her. She hangs upon the flame-cased sun and sucks the light as full as Gideon's fleece. But then her tether calls her. She falls off. And as she dwindles, sheds her smock of gold amidst the sistering planets. So I go out, my little suite is done. I have drawn heat from this contagious sun. To not ungentle death, now forth I run. A poem. I've never read a poem. And those of you who know Hawkins know that his rhyme schemes are difficult. He's hard to read. And when you had to do them in college, you really dreaded it. But then he wrote this beautiful piece while he was at Oxford as a college student, this beautiful piece about a comet. And in my master's thesis, I was able to show that he was referring to the comet of 1864, which appeared just 2 weeks before he wrote that poem. For my doctorate, I went back to Shakespeare, partly to show Dad that I really did inherit his love of Shakespeare, but partly because I was finding out that this guy really, really loved the stars. And he has so many quotes, so many things that he wrote about the night sky, not just in the midst of his plays, but he opened Henry VI, Part 1. Hung be the heavens with black, yield day to night, comets, importing changes in times and place, brandish your crystal tresses in the sky. And finally, one that really doesn't have much to do with the night sky at all, but very much is. I like to believe that Shakespeare, in this famous speech of Macbeth, actually anticipated general relativity by approximately 3 centuries. This is at the very end of Macbeth. And Macbeth has had a terrible life. He knows everybody has found out that he's killed everybody off. He's an evil person. And he's already said, I've lived long enough. And then suddenly some women come up to him and they say, and he says, what's the matter? They look at him and they say, the queen, my lord, is dead. And right away, Macbeth gives up. He's had his life. He wants to end it. This is it. And Shakespeare's sitting there with his quill, or maybe with his Microsoft Word, trying to figure out what to write. But anyway, he's having some problems thinking about the speech that Macbeth is about to make, when there's a tap on his shoulder, and he turns around, and it's God. And God said, Will, take a break. Go get a cup of coffee. I got this. And in those lines, Shakespeare talks about space and time in a way that has not been done before or since. And I'm going to quote that right now. And I'm going to add one final line to what Shakespeare wrote with the help, and then try to connect it to the space-time that Einstein's general theory of relativity was about. She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in its petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and then is heard no more. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, signifying everything. The power in that speech, the power this not just shows literature, but shows a bridge to modern physics, a bridge to space and time. So many things that you really wouldn't expect. Some of you may think, well, it's not really astronomy. If I were your professor, I wouldn't give you a doctorate for that. So I'm going to have to quote you another speech from the same play. It's just after Duncan gets killed, and they're talking about the weird things that are happening. And one of them says, by the clock 'tis day, and yet dark night strangles the traveling lamp. Is it the night's predominance or the day's shame, that darkness does the face of earth entomb, when living light should kiss it? Shakespeare's talking about an eclipse of the sun that took place the year before in 1605, the year before he wrote Macbeth. In fact, he wrote about those eclipses in King Lear, which was written in 1605, most likely, and then remembered them again when he wrote Macbeth. So to bring the two portions of my life together, it's kind of difficult with the pandemic that's been going on for the last almost 2 years. What I've been doing is doing an awful lot of presentations over Zoom, WebEx, and other features. And I've been quoting poems. And it's turned out that I will not give a presentation over Zoom, and also sometimes with a telephone call, without doing some brief or not so brief poetic quotations. And I try to find quotations that have to do with astronomy. Quotations like Hopkins's poem about comets, quotations about Shakespeare, the start of Henry VI and Macbeth, and Tennyson in his famous poem In Memoriam, which is essentially a poem about the rise of science. And now, as we get to the end of my time with you tonight, at least the end of this part of my time with you tonight, I'm going to ask Wendy if she could join me for just a moment so that I could end with just one final quotation. And this is a poem written by Ralph Hudson in about 1913. And it is about a person who is just standing up on a hill, looking up at the night sky. Are you ready, Wendy?
I'm ready.
Here goes. I stood and stared. The sky was lit. The sky was stars all over it. I stood. I knew not why. Without a wish, without a will, I stood upon that silent hill and stared into the sky until my eyes were blind with stars, and still I stared into the sky. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. We'll open it up, and before we go on, thank you. That was really terrific. I would just like to thank Donna McCormick as well from Hampton's Observatory, which I forgot to thank. So thank you, Donna. She really was the coordinator in all of this. So we appreciate that, everything that you did for us. And that was really terrific. So we'll open it up for some questions. You can just unmute your mic and ask David anything you'd like.
You may all unmute now.
What is that machine that's next to you taking center stage there?
This is my telescope. This is Minerva, the real telescope. This is not a background. It is a real telescope. It is a 6-inch diameter f4 telescope. I have had this telescope since 1967. And I got it shortly after I began my search for comets. I remember talking with my grandfather about wanting to get a telescope that was a little smaller than the one I had at the time, but which allowed me to see wider areas of the field. And Grandpa said, "Why do you want something like that?" And I said, "Because when one looks for comets, one wants to have as wide a field of view as possible. And he said, okay, you can get it. And I said, what do you mean, okay, I can get it? I'm saving up to buy it. And he said, no, you're not. I am your grandfather, and I'm going to buy you this telescope. And so he did, and I've had it ever since. It's had multiple changes of tubes, multiple changes of mountings, but the optics, the mirror, is the same as it was
on that.
in 1967.
Why do you call it Minerva?
It's called Minerva. It was one of the names that actually Clyde Tombaugh was considering calling Pluto when that planet was discovered, whatever they call it now. But Minerva, Cronus, and Pluto are the three finalists. And I just like the name Minerva. It is the goddess of wisdom. And I think this telescope, for all it has done, has given me a lot of wisdom over the years. You can get wisdom in two ways. You can go into a library, like the one that is sponsoring our presentation tonight, and you can read and read and read and gain a lot of wisdom. You can also go out into the night sky with this telescope and look at the sky, star by star, and gain a lot of wisdom. I think that being in a library is as thrilling to me as being out under the stars. Good question, thank you.
And David, someone in the chat also said, do I see Dobson's autograph on Minerva? That comes
Yes,
from
you
Donna.
do. You don't miss much, do you? Yeah, John Dobson. Let me see if I can lower it a little bit, right under Minerva. John Dobson actually visited here once, and I asked if he wouldn't mind autographing this telescope, and he did. And he didn't build this telescope, but he did sign it for me. And I always treasure that signature and that memory.
Does anyone else have any questions? You can ask in the chat or unmute your mic, please.
David, how do, if for anyone who would like to get your book or an autographed copy of your book, how do they do that?
There are a couple of ways. I would suggest the best way to do it is to contact Donna, and she can provide with an email address of mine that you can order the book, and then I will autograph it and send it to you. If you really don't care for an autograph copy, you can get the book at a place called Starizona, www.starizona.com. I hope Don doesn't mind me doing that. Anyway, and I know that he has the book as well at his store, and it's called The Nightwatchman's Journey: The Road Not Taken. The subtitle comes from Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, and I was just about to send the book to the publisher for the final printing of it when I realized that it was announced that Frost had been dead long enough, in like 75 years, that his material was now public domain. So I immediately grabbed the title and used it as my subtitle.
Perfect.
How did you actually make a living studying comets?
Michelle, that's a good question. Very good question, because I never did. Remember my mom going up to me when I was observing at Palomar and looking at how Eugene and Carolyn and I were searching and working so hard. And he said, you work very hard, she said, but don't quit your day job. And I thought, what day job? Anyway, after I got my master's degree and relocated to Arizona, I was able to join a group called the International Halley Watch for a few years. I worked with Steve Larson at the University of Arizona, really did enjoy that for 3 years. Then I worked with Larry Lebowski, who I think is well known to some of you, also at the University of Arizona. And with him, I was doing programs with young children, which I dearly love to do. Anyway, after Shoemaker-Levy 9 and what's happened since then, I was able to do other things, and I got most of my income from my writing, although that has sort of gone a lot downhill. And certainly with the pandemic, it has gone very downhill. And one day it might reach bottom and surviving a quarter here and a quarter there. But I really never was able to get a job in astronomy because I never had the education in astronomy. I remember once coming back feeling kind of down from one of my visits to Montreal, and a friend of mine, astronomer Clark Chapman, called me over the telephone. And he said, we're looking for someone to help us with our observing at Kitt Peak. And they were at a program to look for asteroids at the time. And he said, I was wondering if you could recommend somebody for us. And I said, well, gee, Clark, I was actually kind of hoping you'd want me to do that. Fully expecting him to say, well, no, you're not qualified. But he said, David, I was hoping you'd say that. And that actually gave me my first position, paid position in astronomy.
David, we have another question or a comment, I'm not sure. It says, David, I have read that the 18-inch Schmidt telescope at Palomar was decommissioned. Does it still exist? What happened to it?
You're absolutely right, and you're right. It has been decommissioned. It still exists. It was moved into the new Palomar Observatory Museum, which I have never seen, but it's there. It's the first telescope ever used at Palomar Observatory. It's not used for observing anymore, but it still exists. Good question. Somebody asked on the chat when the next solar eclipse is, and I can tell you that easily enough. I can tell you that it will be on April the 8th, 2024. It will be a total eclipse of the sun. I'm pretty sure it's going to be cloudy, and that's don't be too pessimistic, David, about that. But it's in April, and April is one of the cloudiest months. But Richard, it will be very nearly total in Toronto, so don't miss it. It'll
And
be
someone
total
else
in
asked,
Montreal. It'll be total in Dallas, Texas, and that's where Wendy and I will probably be seeing it from. Although we haven't ruled out going to Montreal for it.
David, someone else asked, has there ever been a comet sighting during an eclipse?
Yes, there has been. There have been a couple. 1882 comet named Tewfik, Tewfik, and that was clearly discovered during a total eclipse of the sun. Very, very bright, making a very close pass near the sun. I don't think it was seen at any other time other than during the eclipse. There was also the famous Eclipse Comet in 1948, the year I was born. Apparently discovered during an eclipse and then seen afterwards in the southern hemisphere. There are probably others, but one of the things that I like to do during a total eclipse is to look around the sun to see if there are any comets nearby. Haven't seen any that way though, but it's fun.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Do you think there'll ever be a comet that will come to very close to Earth or maybe even hit it in the future?
That is a very good question, and the answer is yes, definitely. The Earth is going to get hit with a comet. The thing I can't tell you is when. But 1983, some of you may remember seeing a comet called Iris-Araki-Alcock, discovered by Iris and Araki from Japan. And then George Alcock had gotten up, he was needed to use the washroom. He put on a bathrobe and he walked down the stairs, looked out the window and saw a comet out there, fairly bright. And that's one of the ways that you can discover comets. although it's not the way I would recommend, and I haven't done that. Anyway, the chances that we're going to get hit by a comet during our lifetime is approximately 1 in 20,000 for each of us. Well, 1 in 20,000 chances that during our lifetime, while we are breathing in and breathing out, a comet's going to hit the Earth. That means 19,999 chances that we're not, which is all likely. But if you to produce that a little bit longer, it comes to about 1 comet strike about every 100,000 years. So about every 100,000 years, there's about a 50-50 chance that a comet is going to strike the Earth. May not be a big one, may not do global damage. The last time we know a comet hit the Earth and did global damage happened about 65 million years ago. And the only people observing that comet were the Tyrannosaurus Rex and the Brontosaurus with their little telescopes looking out, and that caused the extinction of all the dinosaurs.
David, it's your pal Dave Osobel. I just want to thank you for visiting our observatory all the way from yours.
Well, David, thank you so much. I'm so glad you came tonight. And I'm so glad that you said something. And your mailbox will soon be graced with a copy of the book that I just talked about. And I hope you'll enjoy it.
Thank
Looking
you.
forward to the next book that you come out with. Dave Osobel is a gem to have living in your neighborhood. She is someone who has produced so much and has taught so much about the night sky, about astronomy, and I consider her one of the most intelligent people I've ever met and one of the best writers I have ever encountered in my life. Thanks so much, David.
Why, thank you, and keep
Thank
the poetry
you.
going.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for letting me in, Dave.
Thanks, Ricky.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
To everyone.
thank you everyone for coming tonight.
Hope
And
you get
special
some blue
thanks to,
sky and go out and enjoy the night sky. That's what it's all about.
it's almost dark.
If it only
Thank you,
stopped
Dave.
raining.
Yeah. Take care.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was
Thank you
wonderful.
so
Bye.
much.
Bye-bye now.
Merci.